Is a better world possible? The challenges sometimes seem overwhelming. Billions of people have no access to education, health care, clean drinking water, or even basic human rights. Their poverty is compounded by corruption, conflict over resources, economic stagnation, and violence.
Some countries, whole generations of young people are being lost.
So the cycle goes on and on. So one has to break that cycle.
Where are the solutions? And who are the change makers who can create them? In the past few decades, a powerful force has emerged. New leaders finding new ways to tackle the world's biggest problems. Problems that governments and businesses alone have not been able to overcome.
This is a new language, a new way of looking at the world.
Very different structure, different framework, different reference points.
This global revolution is led by social entrepreneurs, innovative people who respond to local problems, engage their communities in solving them, and accelerate change.
What has happened during the last 5 years is breathtaking.
People have the power of transformation.
This series is an opportunity to learn from the most extraordinary social entrepreneurs, people whose visionary ideas and persistence have enabled millions to transform their own lives. These founding members of Ashoka's Global Academy for Social Entrepreneurship have lessons to offer us all about the power of our own potential. They all started small, from humble beginnings. You are invited to share their journeys, learn their insights, and about the tools they use to produce change.
We have a window of opportunity of a couple of years.
It's a chance that we have to think ahead.
The companies that get this are going to have a huge competitive advantage.
Whether you're in business, the media, government, universities, or the social sector, this series will expose you to a new way of thinking and working that will stretch your own beliefs about what's possible and how you can achieve it. Peter Eigen is the creator of Transparency International. Transparency International has focused worldwide attention on the issue of corruption and leads a global effort to combat it.
These big projects lend themselves to huge kickbacks, to payments of $10, $20, $30 million for individuals on their bank accounts, say in Liechtenstein and Switzerland.
In just a little over a decade, Transparency International has become a formidable force for change, with more than 90 national chapters. It has galvanized the public, private, and social sectors into adopting concrete steps to rid the world of the blight of corruption.
So that was the breakthrough. I believe that this should be an approach which typically social entrepreneurs should pursue.
Throughout a notable career with the World Bank, and now with Transparency International, Dr. Eigen has always been entrepreneurial in his approach to solving problems. In this program, he shares his experiences and strategies in creating global change.
I feel that I had a wonderful childhood. And I remember that with my older sister and my two brothers and a wonderful mother who was a painter and a gymnastics teacher and a musician. And my father, we had a great time together. There was a lot of drawing, there was a lot of music, a lot of singing. Even though it was a tough time. I'm now talking about 43, 44, 45. While we lived in Berlin, I sometimes saw burning houses after bomb attacks. We had to sometimes go into the air raid cellar in our basement. But generally, I felt it was a warm and friendly and very protected environment. So much so that I sometimes fear that I was a bit too non-political. I tended in my early years to take the leadership whenever I was with other kids. I had very early on a Dixieland band, and I set up a jazz club with a few friends. Similar experiences. I was always very interested in horseback riding. So I convinced about 50 of my student friends to form a riding club. And we together then promised to take riding lessons every evening in the week on a farm where a farmer was then interested to buy a few horses and give us riding lessons. So I always had the tendency to enjoy myself, and if the things were not there I wanted to enjoy, then to sort of organize them to happen. I was rather non-political. It was only after my studies as a law student were completed in Erlangen, and after I had gone to Kansas University on a Fulbright fellowship, that I began to feel really committed to what became sort of the main political theme of my life. After a year in Kansas, I hitchhiked to Latin America. And I must say this trip was basically a turning point in my life. I met different groups of people. Some of them were rather comfortable members of the elite, very friendly to me, invited me to stay in their houses. But some of them were people who were unhappy with the injustice of those societies. And when I came with this sense of tension into contact with Latin America, sitting sometimes 24 hours in a small, totally overcrowded bus, I had the feeling that I had been relatively blind, in the past. I became more and more concerned politically the older I got, And a very important part in that was, of course, played by my wife. We had been engaged before I went to Kansas. When I came back, she came with my mother to the port in Antwerp. There, these two women were standing on the pier, and we immediately decided to marry. And in that sense, she became part of my evolution of a person who is much more committed to the social reality of the world than I was before. I went with a famous German professor, his name is Heinrich Kronstein, to Washington. He was a refugee from Germany during the Nazi period at Georgetown University. And when I got my dissertation, my doctoral exams there, he invited me to write my professorial dissertation with him. So I joined his institute as an assistant, and after a couple of months he took me and my wife and my baby daughter at the time to go with him to Georgetown for 1 year, we thought. But lo and behold, after about a year working at Georgetown University, I got an offer from the World Bank, so I gave up my academic plans and became a lawyer in the legal department of the World Bank. My wife then continued her studies as musician, because she was also a medical doctor, but she couldn't practice in the United States. My two boys were born then in the United States. She spent a lot of time with them, but she continued to study at American University, and she taught music and composition at Maryland University. I must say this was a very happy time for us. My wife also did some work as medical doctor, not officially. Every week she went at least twice for, say, from 6 to midnight to see people, patients in inner city clinics. So in many ways, she was a very powerful person. And what was so important for me was that she was totally committed to help the poor and to help the weak. She always pushed the good side of my personality. I was exposed at the World Bank to working as a lawyer on, say, the division of Pakistan and Bangladesh, on helping African countries to pursue their own way of development. And I thought the World Bank gave me a fantastic platform for that. At one point I was asked by President Nyerere of Tanzania whether I wouldn't go to Botswana to help his colleague Seretse Khama, the president of Botswana, who was surrounded by racist countries, South Africa, Rhodesia at the time, and was threatened by their commercial and political domination, whether I wouldn't go there and help him to get their legal system into better shape, to negotiate with big mining investors. I discussed this briefly with my wife, and we decided to take leave of absence from the World Bank for a few years and went to Botswana, funded by the Ford Foundation. And I must say this was again one of the most exciting learning periods I could possibly have wished for. And I totally committed myself and identified myself with the government of Botswana, because I felt this was a fantastic government, very moderate, very democratic, and I felt like one of them. The ideas we developed at the time became part of my personality. And also, for instance, we developed certain systems of taxing mining investors, and this was considered by the experts in the world as total nonsense. But we just stood up to this. We were like a group of third world fighters trying to introduce new systems about the fairness of investment agreements in Africa. I really deeply lived what I consider to be the fight for justice. And I built coalitions and networks to help me. After we drafted a Mines and Minerals Act for Botswana, for instance, I brought in people from the United Nations, I brought people from New York, lawyers, I brought people from Canada, and we had work sessions for a whole week to go through every clause to make sure that the state of the art was captured in there. And in fact, this sort of networking and pulling together resources for a important goal, this is probably one of the things which I always found important in my life. And in fact, the World Bank itself very much has this kind of mechanism built into this huge bureaucracy. And in fact, in many ways, this is how Transparency International works. It brings together many, many elements which then together form a powerful response to an important problem. I was very happy to go back to the World Bank. I worked there in West Africa for a while. I had to learn French much better than I knew before. In Yaoundé I would meet with Manu Dibango and play in his jazz club, jam sessions, or when I was in Abidjan I would go out on the back of a moped into some of the quartiers to Treichville to play with the musicians there and drink beer. So I always try to combine the professional, technocratic with the cultural, with the human, with the value system in society in order to make it fit. What I found so exciting about the World Bank was that it seemed to combine the strength and the resources of the rich countries with a mandate which was clearly and explicitly designed to help the poor people to develop themselves socially and economically. One could move very far to this point, to this balancing point, if you were working on a relatively unimportant country. When I moved on to countries which were more important to the powerful shareholders of the World Bank, and that was clearly the case when I was in charge of Argentina, for instance, this became much more difficult. And there I noticed for the first time that there were interests in operation in the World Bank which were not quite as open and as charitable. And when I was in charge of Chile, I was not allowed to use our money to basically rehabilitate the copper sector in Chile, which would have undermined basically the survival of big copper producers in the United States. Even though this was from a comparative advantage point of view, which we were preaching to everybody, and we were preaching, of course, the market economy, was the most reasonable thing to do. And I had very often the feeling that it was the political expedient of the day which made the shareholders of the World Bank betray the mandate of the World Bank to do the right thing in these countries. Many times during my work in the World Bank, I noticed that corruption was interfering with the decision making. So I remember one case in the Ivory Coast where we had a telecommunications project prepared. The lowest evaluated bid for this project after bidding was $16 million. And they gave the contract to a company, a French company, which was asking $26 million. So when I went there and talked to them, it became very clear to me that corruption had played a role in this. And that became very obvious when finally I was the director of the World Bank office in Nairobi. And in generic terms, I can say that in particular in Kenya, where there were a lot of huge projects which were of great interest to suppliers from the north, which cost between $300 and $500, $600 million. These big projects lend themselves to huge kickbacks, to payments of $10, $20, $30 million for individuals on their bank accounts, say in Liechtenstein and Switzerland. One of the projects which was presented was the so-called Turkwell Dam, which is a big power project in the far west of the country, in a beautiful environment where a river comes out of a mountainous area, which we recognized had no economic merits. There was no market for the electricity, there was no market for the irrigated produce, but it had tremendous risks for the ecology. It was threatening to undermine the livelihood of the Turkana and Samburu people, nomadic tribes living in this area. And therefore we rejected this project, to the chagrin of the Minister of Energy and the President of the country. And to our great disappointment, we saw that this project was very quickly carried through, funded by commercial banks and export financing agencies in the north who had been mobilized by the suppliers of the big project, because for them, of course, this was a huge, wonderful contract which would cost about $300 million. This is an absolutely devastating project, because the Turkana people and the Samburu, they will lose their livelihood because their cattle cannot survive during the dry season. And indeed, studies have been made right now, and they show that many of these people are now destitute in the slums. Plus, the dam itself is silting up very quickly. In fact, the water level of Lake Turkana has fallen. There are now for instance, fish factories and ports, little ports which have been built with Norwegian assistance. They are now about 20 kilometers from the shoreline, because the water has fallen so much. So it is a total disaster, ecologically, socially, macroeconomically, because the debt burden, of course, builds up. And that means that generations of Kenyans will suffer for this project. And that project is not an exception. In Kenya, I could mention to you 3-4 projects of the same nature. In Nigeria, there are huge billion-dollar projects which never earned one penny for the economy of Nigeria, for instance. In fact, it is interesting to sometimes talk to people who have spent their life doing this, going around in Latin America, in Asia, and in Africa to bribe with huge amounts of money in a very sophisticated way the decision makers in order to get the wrong policies, the wrong investment decisions, and thereby create the poverty and misery and despair in these countries, which then is, of course, a good breeding ground for violence and for terrorism. I found very quickly that the World Bank as an institution was not interested to get involved in this. In fact, they felt that this was too much a political matter, which we were not allowed under the charter of the World Bank to get involved in. And I have to say I accepted that. I accepted that the World Bank could not deal with everything which was wrong in the world. And I said, yes, this is a reality, it is ugly, it is destructive, but it is something which is simply not the business of the World Bank. I had a very hard time to defend that position vis-à-vis my wife, and it became particularly bad in Kenya, where she worked in a non-governmental organization as a doctor. She worked there every morning at 7 o'clock. She left my luxurious residence, and came back in the evening at 6, 7 o'clock. And she would say, look, I've seen today 80 patients, what have you done? I mean, in the area in which she worked, about 85% of the young patients she had were AIDS positive. So she was desperate, and she was merciless in her arguments with me. Plus, there were a couple of other donor agencies who said that the World Bank was much too soft with the government as far as corruption is concerned, who said you have to do something. I mean, this cannot continue what we had under President Moi in Kenya. So eventually, I developed a concept together with some African friends, and I presented this to a retreat which we had in Swaziland, where 30 representatives of the World Bank from all over Africa got together with our vice president. And I made a presentation including proposals on how we can deal with it. And everybody there was very excited about it and said, why don't we simply start a task force which will develop together a systematic approach on how we deal with corruption in Africa. And it took only a week, and I got a memorandum from our legal department saying that this was totally off limits, this was too political, we were not allowed to do this. So we decided then, let's do it as private citizens. And we did this in our spare time. And on my next home leave to Washington, which was a couple of weeks later, I was called from the president's office. It was President Conable at the time. And I should come up, and that he wanted to talk to me. And I thought, oh, this is very nice. He probably wants to thank me for having been such a gracious host. He had been visiting me several times in Nairobi. And I arrive in his office, and his secretary says, oh yeah, I have a memo for you. And she handed me a memo from Conable, in which he says, you are not allowed to do this even in your own time. As long as you are a director at the World Bank, this is too embarrassing for us. But that was for me the signal then to say, look, I have to get out of here and do this on my own. It was not a heroic decision at all, because I had my pension. I didn't need any more money, so I could do what I wanted. My wife was very happy that I was, for the first time in her life, focusing 100% on the right thing, rather than making compromises which even in the World Bank you had to do. And this was the beginning then of the final preparations for the launch of Transparency International, which was in May 1993. During this abortive attempt to create an anti-corruption strategy within the World Bank, I made a lot of important contacts within the World Bank, but also outside. So the idea had lit a candle in the minds of quite a number of people, and I received a lot of letters, a lot of telexes, a lot of visitors, phone calls of people who had heard about it. As we had different meetings, we had overlapping participants, 20, 30 people. Now there were about 10 people or so who were very closely connected with this from the very beginning. They all had different skills. I remember in particular the public relations skills of Frank Vogel, and he was incredibly skillful in getting us into the newspapers. There were some people who knew something about corruption. I mean, one American, for instance, who had been the Inspector General of USAID, he was a technician. He was like a policeman, you know, but he knew what we had to look for. We had a business person who represented big business in America, who joined us from the very beginning. We had some people who participated but wanted to stay big in the background. And one of them was Robert McNamara, who was extremely fanatic about us. He liked the idea. So there were a whole range of different people. I should say about my colleagues in the World Bank that the majority of them were absolutely delighted about what we did. It was like taking a lid of a steam cooker, you know. They all were suffering from the fact that their own work was handicapped by the corruption they met in their various countries. So it was a very exciting time where we moved very quickly from a one-man show, which was basically me working on my kitchen table, to a two-man show when a student began to help me free of charge. And then finally I was able to hire somebody, a former East German diplomat who had lost her job after the wall had come down, and she was willing to work basically for a very low salary. Until we finally had in '94 a managing director, a very good person, Jeremy Pope, who came from the Commonwealth Secretariat. And then gradually our organization was riding on the crest of a big wave of support, and this is where we are now. In our preparation of the launch conference of Transparency International, we had developed a number of insights which are still the guiding principles today. First of all, we knew that we could not investigate individual cases to expose them, as Amnesty International is doing in their area, because we wanted to bring people to join us who were even involved in corruption, because corruption is so complex and it is so technical in many ways that you needed the people who really know what they are talking about to join you and work together on joint programs. So that was probably the most important shift from what I had personally had in mind when I left Kenya. The second insight was that we would have to deal with corruption with the local knowledge and the local enthusiasm and the local courage and credibility which has to come from each society itself. So we knew very quickly that we wouldn't be able to operate like the Catholic Church, you know, or like the World Bank, sort of preaching from the center what everybody else had to do. And therefore we began very early on to initiate the creation of what we call national chapters, which are non-governmental organizations organize in various countries under their own systems, under their own conditions. And the third important insight was that very often when you deal with corruption, people focus mainly on punishing. But in our opinion, criminal law is a relatively blunt weapon against corruption. We have a rather holistic approach. We see at all the different elements of an integrity system which have to be in place in order to protect society against corruption. This includes legal matters, laws, institutions, guidelines. It includes the role of the media, their independence, their competence to deal with corruption. It includes very technical matters like how you select, for instance, contractors, under international competitive bidding or so. How much transparency you enforce in your legislative body. It includes matters like how you deal with conflict of interest in a society, and so on. So it is like a mosaic of many different elements which together create the overall system of integrity. And these were things which we learned very early on in our brainstorming sessions leading up to the launch of our organization. Once we were launched, we had a governance structure in our organization. We had a board of 12 people. And then we also, from very early on, decided that we needed what we then called the Advisory Council. And therefore we were very happy to include Oscar Arias, for instance, from the very beginning, Richard von Weizsäcker, Obasanjo from Nigeria, Festus Mogae from Botswana, famous and important people from a wide spectrum of different ideologies and different political positions who gave their name and said, we are supporting this. And with this kind of starting capital, we began to explore the possibility to set up national chapters. I got very responsive feedback from Ecuador in particular, which is considered to be one of the most corrupt countries in the world. And I put together a team of a few people, and we traveled there in the fall of 1993. And I put on a piece of paper at the time what I consider to be the most important elements of the integrity system, like a checklist, sort of a handwritten thing. And I compared this with the ideas of some of my supporters, like Jeremy Pope, who was still at the Commonwealth Secretariat at the time. And after our first annual meeting, which we had in Ecuador, where Obasanjo came and quite a number of other prominent people, Oscar Arias, they proposed that we turn this into a book, and this became our most important tool, which the Ford Foundation financed, which is called the Integrity Source Book. So it is sort of an annotated checklist, basically, of what one can use in order to look at in a holistic way, various elements of an integrity system in a country where one wants to work, We always had the sense that we would mainly focus on development projects, on large transactions. But since we had the idea that our national chapters should define their own agenda, that they should decide what their priorities are, we very quickly caught in a dilemma, because some of them said we are not really interested in these big international transactions. We don't care, whether our president gets another $1 million on some bank account somewhere in Europe or so. What we care about is whether a policeman, for instance, extorts money from the poor and the powerless in our slums, or whether a teacher, for instance, extorts money from the parents of his students in order to let them come to school or give them a grade. And therefore, we began to look at the corruption also within countries, the corruption within the North, In particular, the German chapter, for instance, very early on said, look, if you want to carry an anti-corruption message into the world, we have to clean up our own nest first. And there, a very frightening revelation happened. I found out that basically the establishment in my own country were not really against corruption as long as it happened outside Germany. We began to go to the media, began to have conferences in which we exposed this. Many of the political and business leaders felt that our attempt to eradicate corruption was a rather idealistic, naive attempt. And therefore, they tried everything to avoid a big conflict with us. Yet they really wanted us to go away as quickly as possible. While paradoxically, many of the governments in the South had understood, in particular a new generation of more enlightened leaders there, that corruption was destroying them. It was very evident, for instance, at a conference which I attended of the Global Coalition for Africa in The Hague, where the then president of Ethiopia rose and addressed the ministers of development of the North, including the German Minister of Development, and said, we are trying to do our damnness to clean up our own nest, and we are working with Transparency International on this. But please, our brothers from the North, stop your own exporters from bribing our elites and undermining our economic management. So the real breakthrough came when we managed to get into a dialogue with the business leadership here in Germany, where we, over a period of 2 years, agreed with them that what they were doing was not simply living up to normal conditions, but rather was blatant bribery, blatant perversion of economic decision-making. And at the last meeting, they went so far as to say, yes, we have to try to stop it, but how can we stop? Because our competitors will bribe and they will get all the contracts and we will go under. So it was a dilemma, a true sort of prisoner's dilemma, where the company or the exporting country which behaves better than the others is punished for it. And I find this quite interesting, because this kind of prisoner's dilemma exists not only in the area of fighting corruption, it exists also in other areas of failed global governance, in the area of human rights violations, of child labor, exploitation of women and slaves, the violation of labor standards, destruction of the environment, because very often it is more expensive to produce with a higher standard of social responsibility. Our exit route from this dilemma was an attempt to help them to find a way to avoid corruption without losing contracts. And we had a couple of ideas how we could do this. I mean, in a very simple way, I proposed that we should find and identify the competitors in certain markets where we knew that only very few companies were bidding for certain major contracts. This is true in, say, civil works contracts financed by the World Bank or so, where sometimes you have 5, perhaps 8 global companies pre-qualified to participate. Or that is also true in the privatization of public utilities, of telecommunications companies, or in the area of minerals, extractive industries, petroleum development. We offered that we would try to bring in situations like that the competitors together and make arrangements that they all stop bribing simultaneously, and that we would put in place a system of monitoring, a system of sanctions. And when the businessmen assembled at the Aspen Institute here in Berlin with us, when they heard that, they said, if you are able to put this in place, then we are going to support you, because we want to get away from corruption. We understand that corruption is not only destroying the host country, which is afflicted by this cancer, but is also destroying the company itself, which is allowing this kind of behavior. the companies signed an open letter to the German government in which they demanded from the Kohl government, which had been resisting any attempt to fight international corruption, to participate in the negotiations of a convention which was being prepared with our help under the auspices of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, under the OECD. And that convention then basically sealed a tremendous quantum jump in the improvement of the world, because 35 exporting countries signed a binding convention in which they promised to change their own laws in order to prohibit their own exporters from bribing. Now this was a tremendous step. It entered into force in 1999. That was also the time when in Germany the government changed. They abolished the tax deductibility of foreign bribes, which had been a particularly scandalous feature of this system which existed earlier. And from that moment on, at least on paper, the system has changed in order to get rid of international corruption. So that was the breakthrough. And I'm spending so much time on this because I believe that this should be an approach which typically social entrepreneurs should pursue. They should try to find the common interest of the other actors and try to find ways in which they can behave better without losing out in the process. One of the great achievements of Transparency International was to convince the participants of the Global Compact of Kofi Annan to introduce to the 9 principles of social responsibility on human rights, on the environment, and on labor conditions, to add to these 9 conditions a 10th principle, prohibiting corruption. I worked very hard to make it clear in every meeting where I was invited in New York and in other places that without fighting corruption, these 9 other principles would be useless. And I was such a pain, in the ears of everybody participating, including Kofi Annan himself, that he promised to me here in Berlin at one of the meetings with German business that he would eventually add a 10th principle, which he called jokingly the Peter principle. So for us it was a reason to celebrate, because it came together, of course, with the passage of the UN Convention Against Corruption. So the legal system has changed. The awareness of the world has been changed. In terms of awareness building, probably the most important tool was our annual Corruption Perception Index, which is a ranking of countries by the degree of perceived corruption in these countries. I myself was against it, and when a young scholar, Johann Lambsdorff, came and worked with us as a summer intern, and he began to develop a methodology on how to do it, I thought it was pretty stupid and pretty naive, to try to do this. And what he did then was to show this to a journalist of Der Spiegel under the strict understanding that this would be confidential. That was a very short list at the time, 54 countries. And to our tremendous surprise, we saw the Monday thereafter in Der Spiegel this list, source Transparency International. And it has to become one of our most powerful tools to give a wake-up call to the world every year about the evolution of corruption. Lambsdorff let an animal escape before it had really matured, and then helped us to turn it into a very useful vehicle for our work. One of our problems, on the one hand, but also great opportunities, was the fact that in the United States there is this Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, that Jimmy Carter has introduced in 1977, because that made it illegal for an American company to bribe outside the US. And therefore, very often companies that were competing with Germans or with Japanese or with French companies for big contracts, they felt that they were at a tremendous disadvantage. And therefore, they were our allies in the beginning when we tried to introduce the same discipline on their competitors, which was on the one hand a great thing for us, but it also created that tremendous risk that we would be seen as being sort of lackeys of corporate America, which in general I think is an interesting issue also for me personally. That is that we have to continuously keep a balance in getting too close to certain actors and being too hostile to them. This is also true inside the organization, because we are 90 national chapters, and there have been great differences. I mean, there are, say, our chapter in Zimbabwe is extremely political and belligerent. I mean, they go out and demonstrate, and they are beaten up. I mean, the head of our chapter has been arrested several times, and I believe in a slightly different approach, and I even feel that this might jeopardize the access we have to other more traditional actors. And but other national chapters sympathize with this. They believe that we are just old white men sitting here in Berlin trying to be part of the establishment, rather than changing it. So it's a continuous balancing act within the organization, within the many chapters we have. So this is personally for me a rather exhausting part of the leadership in Transparency International. All the time while I was doing this work, I was of course tremendously supported by my wife Jutta. 3 years ago she had some pain, and we found out that this was a cancer, and she lived another year where I spent practically all my time with her, and died in the summer of 2002. So there came a time when I traveled much more for Transparency International, because I tried to run away from being alone here. But I have to say, to my great delight, I met Gesine Schwan. In fact, I knew her earlier. She was a friend of Jutta's also, and had accompanied us in the last months of her disease. And we became so close that we traveled together. And when we were at Harvard University, she received a phone call from Gerhard Schröder, Federal Chancellor, who asked her whether she wanted to run for president. And she accepted and lost to Horst Köhler, the former head of the IMF. And I became a very close ally in this effort. And some people saw me already as the First Lady of Germany. So it became a very interesting time, and when it was over, we had seen that there are so many things in common between us that we thought the best thing would be to marry. So it's a wonderful, wonderful thing that has happened to us. It's, I think, a natural tendency if you get older that you worry that things cannot continue without you. But this is, of course, one of the vanities which human beings have. You simply need to take the risk of having a different cut of strengths and weaknesses at the leadership. Now, we have a very good management team, a very good managing director, so I gave up that function to him, and I'm now only the chairman. And in fact, at the end of this current period, I will not run again for chairman. Of course, all of this does not mean that I will not remain very active. So in that sense, I expect that I will continue for many years to spend about at least half of my time for Transparency International. But then I also have developed some more general ideas which do not only deal with the issue of corruption, but which deal with other issues of global governance. In particular, poverty and human rights violations, destruction of the environment. So that is something which I would like to pursue partly as a professor. I'm now an honorary professor at the Freie Universität here, but perhaps even creating some kind of a new institute which will focus particularly on this. And there, of course, it's a very fortunate coincidence that my wife is the president of a fascinating new university, and as part of her agenda, I will participate in the creation of a new governance school together with Humboldt University in Berlin. I feel very fortunate in the way in which things have gone, so I have in no way the sense that I'm sacrificing my life for something else, or that I'm taking a heroic course or an altruistic course or so. I feel that this is tremendous fun, what I'm doing. It's tremendously satisfying. It's tremendously exciting to see that one has an impact which brings about more justice and fairness in the world.
Transparency International is a citizen-based organization that creates tools, coalitions, and campaigns to fight corruption locally, nationally, and globally.
In some countries, whole generations of young people are being lost because their parents cannot afford the bribes which are being demanded.
Transparency International has pioneered the worldwide creation of legal frameworks to combat corruption, and works tirelessly with global partners and more than 90 national chapters to enforce them. Peter Eigen is its creator.
What has happened during the last 5 years is breathtaking. So in a way we have a window of opportunity of a couple of years.
In this program, Peter Eigen describes the terrible toll that corruption takes in the lives of millions of people, how social, political, and legal breakthroughs offer great hope of neutralizing it, and how everyone can join the growing campaign to eliminate one of humanity's greatest injustices.
Of course, a precondition of having an energetic fight against corruption is that there is a awareness among the people, among the decision makers, that corruption is extremely dangerous and that something has to be done about it. And one of our most important tools in this area has been the global index which we produce every year, the Corruption Perception Index. This is an index in which we rank countries by the perception of thousands of people who are being questioned by independent opinion surveys, last year by 17 independent surveys, about their perception of how important corruption is in a given country. This list has become a major tool. In fact, it is expected with some anxiety by some countries and is always put on the front page of many important media and has been like a miraculous tool to put our agenda on center stage in the world. We have been criticized that this is somewhat one-sided. In particular, Prime Minister Mahathir of Malaysia criticized us that this looks only at the perceived corruption by the recipients of bribes, and that therefore naturally the third world looks worse than basically the hand that gives and offers the bribes. And I think he is right. This was indeed a bias which is built in the Corruption Perception Index, but we had no data on the perceived corruption of the companies coming from various countries in the exporting world. And therefore we had to develop our own survey, and we have done this, and that is our Bribe Payers Index. It was a very revealing instrument, which by the way also ranked various sectors in accordance with their perceived vulnerability to bribery, where the construction sector is the worst, arms trade and arms and military supplies is the second, then comes the energy sector. It's sort of instinctively the right order, and has helped us to deal with some of the issues in these sectors more effectively. There has been a criticism that if we only measure perceptions, it is a rather impressionistic, subjective criterion, which may be very unfair. It is practically impossible to prove corruption cases, and therefore it is futile to try to simply measure actual corruption, proven corruption. Therefore, we simply had to take a proxy for this, and that proxy is what educated people, what victims of corruption, what participants in corrupt deals, what they perceive to be the corruption in a given situation. And we found that this is an extremely important proxy which helped us to paint an image of the reality. Perceptions are very important, but because of the weaknesses we have also begun to apply some other methods, in particular in surveys which are done within countries. So we had surveys within Mexico, within Peru, within Kenya, for instance. Household surveys asking people, how much money does your family have to pay every year for bribes? How often are you asked for a bribe? Did you pay bribes yourself? And so on. And based on these surveys, we have started a new tool which we call the Corruption Barometer, which this year has quite a number of countries listed. So building awareness is a tremendously important starting point for fighting corruption. And that awareness, of course, has tremendously changed in the last, I would say, 5 years.
An explosion in innovation has created a global economy that has benefited millions of people. But many others have suffered, with no governance structure in place to protect the public good.
Global governance right now is tilted towards the interests of the powerful and rich. And therefore a way has to be found to give a voice to the billions and billions of people who live without proper resources.
Peter Eigen is the founder of Transparency International, a global organization that has successfully strengthened global governance in the area of corruption. In this program, he explains how a powerful civil society can help build an enabling environment in which global governance can flourish.
It is amazing how important civil society organizations have been in the changes which occurred in the world during the last 15-20 years.
He describes how members of civil society can work together and in partnership with the business community, governments, and academia to create a better world for everyone.
Global governance has to be more responsive to the interests of the poor. Global governance right now is tilted towards the interests of the powerful and rich, and therefore a way has to be found to give a voice to the billions and billions of people who live without proper resources. The way one can do this is only by giving a stronger say to the representatives of these people, and as long as, for instance, their governments are themselves corrupt and don't have compassion for their own poor people, as we very often see by the tremendous wealth which is amassed by the governments and politicians in very poor countries. There has to be some other way, and I believe that this is the area where civil society organizations have a tremendous responsibility. Well, civil society organizations have to, of course, live up to this new responsibility. They have to, in my opinion, become much more competent to understand the complexities of the area in which they want to take on responsibilities. This is why, for instance, I believe strongly our universities have to help to train and educate more leaders for civil society, and research and so on has to focus more on the questions which are posed by civil society. But civil society leaders themselves have to be much more open to interact and formulate questions, for instance, to academia to get their support. Civil society also has to be much more open to cooperate with the traditional actors of governance. So they should not be too one-sided in, for instance, condemning the World Bank, condemning major multinational corporations. They should rather try to understand their interests and their strengths and cater to these interests and strengths in order to form compromises which will lead to change. Civil society organizations, of course, have to also work on their own integrity and their own transparency. They have to work on their own decision-making processes, which have to be participatory and have to be open. So in a way, civil society organizations in the final analysis have to stand the competition which they have for ideas and for interests, and have to make it in a market of good ideas. I mean, this is eventually the source of their legitimacy. And in that sense, basically it's the rule of the market which also decides whether a certain civil society organization with its particular ideas and its approaches will have impact or not.
Bill Drayton is the founder of Ashoka, Innovators for the Public. Ashoka works at the forefront of the rapidly growing field of social entrepreneurship. It supports the work of entrepreneurs worldwide who solve social problems in far-reaching, pattern-changing ways.
Our job is not to give people fish. It's not to teach them how to fish. It's to build a new and better fishing industry.
From modest beginnings in the early 1980s, Ashoka has grown into a community of over 1,500 fellows, supported by staff members, partners, and volunteers in over 50 countries.
88% of the people we elect at the end of 5 years have had other institutions copy their ideas. 59% have achieved national policy impact, and on average, they're serving 174,000 people.
Bill Drayton has been a social entrepreneur all his life. He shares his story to provide insights into what it takes to create widespread social change.
The development of Ashoka is very typical of the development of any major entrepreneurial venture. The idea, of course, dates back at least to the time I was an undergraduate. There was the challenge that came very sharp once I had been in India. You must close this north-south gap. You must speed up development, democracy in the world. So there are many things that were very clear, but something was missing, and that was that the historical moment wasn't ripe, and also in our personal lives it wasn't ripe. We needed to go through our apprenticeship. I had to spend time at McKinsey learning how the world works, learning the key skills of how you cause change. Then, as I was at EPA, we sensed that the historical moment was coming. You could hear the hinge creaking. And what we were seeing very personally was that our friends, my friends in India and elsewhere, were starting to be social entrepreneurs. And what was happening was that the post-independence generation in Asia was coming of professional age. They were now in their 30s. Their parents thought getting control of the government, take over those instruments, that was the focus. The next generation grew in an environment with these overpowering government institutions, and some of them felt they could do better. And so you could see the beginning of a very significant wave of social entrepreneurs who were having a very difficult time. No word to describe the field, no support institutions, a lot of doubt ranging from their family to the government. I said, oh, this looks like this is the time. Then we asked, all right, well, how do we intervene? Where can you intervene which will have the biggest possible impact with very modest resources, all we could imagine available to us at the time? And that is the moment when a person and an idea have finished their apprenticeship, and they know, the entrepreneur knows that they have an idea that is the next big generic step for their field. Then all you want to do is go full-time and run with this idea. Seize the historical moment. But who are you? What is this idea? It doesn't fit any of the existing patterns because they were set up to serve the old idea. At that point, a little bit makes all the difference. Very little money, so you can look your family in the eye and say, I know it's crazy to leave my tenured job in a nice, safe institution. You've got to be able to look them in the eye and say, I'm going to do this. And we give you the financial ability to do that if you need it. But beyond that, you now are a part of a family of your peers. And your uncle can see that these people that are very respected in your society and internationally think your work is important, believe in you. The early years of Ashoka, as for almost all our fellows, raising money was a nightmare. No funding from any institutional foundation for our first 6 years. Basically, the Klingenstein, Lipkin, and Golden families, that was it. And I was working part-time at McKinsey, commuting to New York. Ashoka was going, and it was a very crazy time. And that overload is what made the MacArthur sudden phone call in November of 1984, miraculous. The MacArthur Foundation had chosen me to be one of its fellows, which gave me 5 years' income. And also, very importantly, for people who could not understand what Ashoka was about, gave me a sort of vaguely reputable category to fit into. It was a very key, liberating moment. I was able to go on leave from McKinsey, which I'm still technically on leave.
Muhammad Yunus is the founder of Grameen Bank. Grameen loans money for self-employment to over 4 million poor women in Bangladesh.
You cannot get a dollar without a dollar in your hand. In the poor people, nobody gives the first dollar to catch the next dollar.
Dr. Yunus designed Grameen to serve people who have no collateral. 5 borrowers form a group and guarantee each other's loans. The repayment rate is greater than 98%. More than half of Grameen's members have moved their families out of poverty.
We have demonstrated beyond anybody's doubt that it works and is sustainable, and it can work in all kinds of cultural and economic situations.
Grameen Bank has become a model for hundreds of microfinance programs around the world, serving tens of millions of the world's poorest citizens. In this program, Dr. Yunus shares the experience and insights gained in his struggle to build the world's leading poor people's bank.
I toyed around several alternatives. Finally, I decided maybe I should link them with the local bank. Bank is the one who should be lending money. This is their business. This is their job. So with enthusiasm, I go to the branch manager or the bank manager who is located in the campus, propose to him that he lend money to the poor people in the village. He fell from the sky. He couldn't believe I even said that. He said, no, it can't be done. It can't be done. I said, why not? Because, he said, poor people are not creditworthy. What does creditworthy mean? Creditworthy means he will not be able to pay back. I said, how do you know? Did you lend them at all? He said, no, I never lent them. I said, how do you know? I said, everybody knows that. Because they are poor, no matter how much money you give, they will eat and the money will be over. They can't pay you back. So I went to higher officials in the city, downtown. I talked to them. They said the same thing. So every time I go and see somebody, they tell me the same thing. And it went on for months. I couldn't find the door to open. Then I learned something from them and I used it. I said, why don't you accept me as a guarantor? I become your guarantor. I sign all your documents. Risk is on me, not on you. You give the money. I thought it's such a straightforward proposal, they will immediately go for it. They didn't. In all, there were more than 6 months. Finally, I was accepted as a guarantor. And it worked. I was very excited that it worked. But the bank manager doesn't change his mind. He said it may work in one village, but if you do it in 2 villages, it will never work. I said, okay, let me do it in 2 villages. So I did it in 2 villages, it worked. He said, well, 1 village and 2 villages are the same thing. Maybe you should do it in 5 villages. So I did it in 5 villages. It worked. But he doesn't change his mind. After I have done this several rounds, and I realized that if I do the whole world, he's not going to change his mind. Maybe I should forget about him. So I thought maybe I should have a separate bank doing exactly what I'm doing. And that idea started haunting me. That why don't I have a bank for the poor people?
In the early 1970s, the newly independent country of Bangladesh was reeling under the effects of war, flood, and famine. Fazl Hassan Abid organized a relief effort that was quickly transformed into something very different.
We came to the conclusion that relief and rehabilitation is not going to be enough. It has to be a long-term commitment to development. People were poor and going to remain poor unless we bring about change.
Abid understood that one does not simply develop people. People must develop themselves. Through the Bangladesh Rural Advancement Committee, now simply known as BRAC, he has enabled millions of people to break away from poverty.
Poor people are poor because they are powerless. You must organize people for power. They must organize themselves in such a way that they can change their lives.
In this program, Abid shares his story and that of BRAC as it has grown from a small group of dedicated staff members to a giant non-government organization of over 4 million members, which continues to be a guiding light for all who take on the task of global development.
At that time, there was a Brazilian educator named Paulo Freire, whose book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, was published in 1973. And I think early in 73, I read that book. His thesis was that the poor people are poor because they are powerless. You must organize people for power. They must organize themselves in such a way. They must understand the dynamics of their communities in such a way that they can change their lives. So that book sort of provided a theoretical framework for us to try and develop people for power. So we set up a whole 100 lessons in which we sort of started building self-worth in people. And through that process, you build self-confidence that they can change their condition and they don't have to live in poverty and degradation forever. We go into a village, a field worker, we call him a program organizer. He goes into a village and organizes maybe half a dozen people, maybe 15 or 16 people, and say that you form a group and then you bring in more people till you are about 30 to 40, and then a village group is in existence. And then once we have got this 40 people in a village organization, we call them, then we start other programs like saving starts even before the group is complete. But once the group is complete, then of course we'll provide credit. We'll also provide some training programs like legal education so that they understand their rights and obligations. In each village we have 1, 2 or 3 groups of 40 women. So about 10 groups to 1 PO. And in average area office I think we have got about 20 POs. The 20 POs will look after about 200 groups. 200 multiplied by 40. It could be as many as about 8,000. So area office will cover about 7,000 to 8,000 group members. So you replicate throughout the country and you have 4.5 million groups.